Welcome to Fantasy Football. Today, we're coming to you live from our homes once again. We're going to take some time here on Friday to review the latest 12-team non-PPR mock draft that we did. This was following free agency. Wanted to take a look at how some of the impact on the NFL moves changed some things for our fantasy moves and how that could maybe change some things for your upcoming drafts. Now, no rookies were involved in this mock draft. This is a 2 running back, 3 wide receiver league. We all took part in it. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Dave Richard, Heath Cummings, Adam Mazer. You see all our names above our wonderful faces there. And we're going to take some time now to break down the first round. So let's take a look at it, guys, and how the first round unfolded here. Not too much surprise at the top when you take a look at McCaffrey, even in non-PPR, Barkley, Elliott going number 3, Dalvin Cook number 4, Michael Thomas, the first wide receiver, comes off at number 5. And then our buddy Dave Richard threw us a little bit of a curveball, taking Derrick Henry over Alvin Kamara. So we'll stop right there. We'll talk about those 2 picks. Dave, why Henry over Kamara?
Because Kamara's terrible. No, I'm just kidding. That's not it. Listen, it's a PPR versus non-PPR thing. There's no question Kamara's better in PPR, but in non-PPR, I think there's a better chance for Derrick Henry to get you to that 1,500-yard double-digit touchdown mark than Alvin Kamara. And I admit that Kamara's done that 2 of his first 3 seasons in the National Football League. But if you go back and you look at the metrics, last year he wasn't quite as good catching the ball. Last year he wasn't as elusive as Derrick Henry. We can chalk it up to the injury all we want. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to come back and hit those marks again a year after not doing it. And this is a Saints team that still has Latavius Murray. He'll take a little bit of work away from Kamara. And they added Emmanuel Sanders. And Sanders, I believe, will be their slot receiver. He can take some targets away from Alvin Kamara. It makes me a little bit nervous, whereas Derrick Henry, yeah, I'm nervous. The guy had 400 touches last year. But the guy is built like a brick house, and he has been unstoppable since the second half of the 2018 season. So I'm putting my chips on Derrick Henry in non-PPR ahead of Kamara, ahead of Joe Mixon, ahead of a lot of other players.
All right, Heath, I don't think you have it ranked that way. Tell me why you would rather have Kamara over Henry.
Yeah, and this is really a very close one. This is one of those situations where in my early projections, I actually have Henry projected for more non-PPR points than I do for Alvin Kamara, but I would draft Kamara first just simply because his production feels a lot safer. It's not like he needs 400 touches to be a top 4 or 5 running back. He's shown us that he can do it on 200 touches. He doesn't have quite the same breakdown risk that Henry does because of how many touches Henry had last year. And he doesn't have quite the same risk. Like, I think there is still a significant risk for the Titans because they gave all that money to Tannehill and to Derrick Henry. The rest of the team just isn't as good, and they don't find themselves in as many run-heavy situations where they have the lead. That could be a major problem for Derrick Henry. So I don't think this is a huge leap in non-PPR. In PPR, it's not particularly close, but I would prefer Alvin Kamara to Derrick Henry.
All right, so Heath likes Kamara over Henry. Dave likes Henry over Kamara. Adam, which way do you come out on those 2 guys?
I thought this would be an easy question to answer, and then I started digging into the numbers and coming up with my theory, and about 30 minutes later, I said, all right, it's really very close. It comes down to this. Do you think Kamara is more likely to repeat his 2018 season, or Henry's more likely to repeat his 2019 season? And I'm actually going to lean with Heath. I'm just going to say this. Because Derrick Henry does have a game script problem potentially, and there is no bad game script for Alvin Kamara, there are fewer variables that could work against Alvin Kamara. I'm going to go with Kamara here. I do think he's safer. And the catches, they don't count. The receptions don't count, but it does give you a bit of a safety net, another source of total yards. So I'll go with Kamara, but I do think it's a very complicated and tough question.
Yeah, a lot of people probably going to have a tough call on this. For me, it's easy. I'm going to take Kamara. I'm just so concerned about Derrick Henry with the workload from last year. I do think there could be potential injury risk coming into the 2020 campaign. So I will take Kamara easily over Henry, but I do understand why there could be some trepidation and why Dave is going with Henry over Kamara. As we continue to look at the first round, we get toward the back end, some receivers coming off the board. We get to Travis Kelce, the tight end, at number 9. Then we get to Tyreek Hill to Adam Mazer at number 10. I took Julio Jones at number 11. There's a name missing on this list, no DeAndre Hopkins. So Tyreek Hill is the 3rd wide receiver off the board. Excuse me, the 3rd wide receiver off the board behind Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams. Heath, did that surprise you that Hill went that high, or is that something you think we'll see?
I think we could see it in non-PPR. Adam talked about it on yesterday's show that Hill doesn't necessarily catch a lot of passes, but that doesn't matter again in this format. And he's got Patrick Mahomes, and he's got the track record of being one of the most efficient wide receivers in NFL history. If you are a little bit concerned that Calvin Ridley is going to take a bigger chunk of the pie, or that Julio Jones' age is a concern, if you're worried about DeAndre Hopkins' target share in the new offense in Arizona, or just learning that new offense in an abbreviated offseason, I don't think it is a problem to take Tyreek Hill as the number 3 wide receiver. 1 and 2 feels pretty set in stone to me with Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams. I think you can make a pretty solid argument for 3 or 4 different guys to be the number 3 wide receiver.
Adam, take us through your thought process. You had Tyreek Hill, you had Julio Jones, you had DeAndre Hopkins, some other running backs available to you, Aaron Jones and Joe Mixon. Why Tyreek Hill?
Well, it must be a Freaky Friday because I am agreeing with Heath a lot. And yeah, I do think that number 1 and 2 are Thomas and Devontae Adams. But Tyreek Hill is so efficient. And here was my process, right? First of all, it's a 3-receiver league with a flex. So if it were 2-receiver league, I may have gone running back with the number 10 pick and then the number 15 pick. But I looked at the running backs who were available, and I felt like I could still get one in the same tier in the second round. So I thought if I didn't take a wide receiver here, Tyreek Hill and Julio Jones and possibly DeAndre Hopkins were all going to be off the board. If I had taken Chris Godwin or something like that, it would have been the end of the world. But I definitely wanted a wide receiver here with the format with the 3 wide receivers. And I took Hill. And I do all the things that Heath said. I mean, there could be a little bit of decline coming for Julio Jones. He's 31. Tyreek Hill's 26. A little bit of uncertainty with DeAndre Hopkins going to a new team, even though I still like him plenty. And I just think the Chiefs' passing offense greatly underachieved last year with Mahomes missing a couple of games, with him playing hurt for almost the entire season. So I think you're going to see a much better performance from Tyreek Hill, who, by the way, was the number 1 wide receiver in this format in 2018.
So Heath says there's no question about the top 2 wide receivers. I agree with that with Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams. But Dave, you would still take DeAndre Hopkins, not only ahead of Tyreek Hill, but also ahead of Adams. So make the case for DeAndre Hopkins ahead of these 2 guys in terms of Tyreek Hill and Julio Jones.
Because I still feel that he's going to be a huge part of that offense in Arizona, just like he was in Houston. And I think he's going to be a monster in the end zone for a team that was able to move the ball quite well all season long. They just couldn't punch it in. They didn't have the personnel for it. Hopkins gives them some of that personnel, and I could see him finishing with 10 touchdowns in Arizona, catching some bullets from Kyler Murray. There is a bit of an issue about the targets, I'll admit that, but I still think he'll be north of 130 over the balance of the season, and I think he'll be able to come up with over 1,200 yards doing so. Hopkins has been a reliable fantasy receiver for the past couple of seasons. I think he'll continue to do that moving forward.
Yeah, but all those guys have been reliable wide receivers. So you look at Julio Jones, again, unless there's a fall off like Heath and Adam alluded to, could see a situation there. Tyreek Hill for the last couple of years has been reliable when Patrick Mahomes has been healthy. So, we'll see what happens with Hopkins changing teams, how that impacts his fantasy value. I was thrilled to get him in round 2, but I was not taking him in round 1. I took Julio Jones at number 11. Let's transition now to round 2 as we start to see a little bit more running backs coming off the board earlier in the round. Joe Mixon being the first guy that kicks it off to our buddy Ben Trager. And as you see, Nick Chubb falls to round 2. Now, we get some pushback about should Nick Chubb be a first-round pick. A lot of people concerned about the addition of, the keeping of Kareem Hunt staying on the roster. The fact that he's going to get, got a second-round tender, going to still be part of the Browns roster. Keith takes Nick Chubb at 16th overall after Adam, who was a little bit of a fraud, saying that he would take Miles Sanders in round 1. He's ends up getting him in round 2, so good value there, but not sticking to his guns about when he's going to take Miles Sanders. But in terms of Sanders and Chubb, Dave, are you surprised to see Sanders go over Chubb? And I think you probably would have it the other way, Chubb over Sanders, right?
I would. Chubb over Sanders, but it's really close, and I totally get Adam Azer's argument for why Miles Sanders should be there. And it's going to be really hard to keep it that way if the NFL draft comes and goes and Philadelphia doesn't add another running back, because Sanders really toward the end of last season was just incredible. And I think Philadelphia, and Howie Roseman talked about this. The GM of the Eagles just got done talking about they need to add another running back. So maybe it'll be a little bit more of a committee, and that'll pop Azer's bubble, and Miles Sanders will be more of a number 2 pick consensus-wise. But I think Nick Chubb is a tremendous talent. I think the Browns are going to run the ball a bunch. I think he'll be the primary back there. And I think he's got potential, not for 1,500 total yards, but probably in the neighborhood of 1,300 and maybe 8 or 9 touchdowns. I think that's a little bit safer than what we could say for Miles Sanders going into his second year, believe it or not.
Heath, you picked after Adam, who took Sanders with the third pick of the second round. If he had taken Chubb, would you have taken Sanders there?
Nope. I was thrilled that Nick Chubb was there. I was thinking I was probably going to start with Travis Kelce and a wide receiver. Chubb was my top running back when I took Kelce in the first round. And I just think you look at these two backs, and I'm not so sure that the upside for Sanders might not be the expectation for Chubb. Even last year, when we've talked about how he wasn't as good on a per-game basis once Kareem Hunt was there. Even in those last 8 games, he was on pace for more than 300 touches in those final 8 games. He was on pace for like 1,500 yards. The only problem was that he only scored 2 touchdowns, and that's just a fluke. I expect Nick Chubb to be, in this format especially, to be a top 8 back relatively easily. And maybe Miles Sanders can get to that point as well, but I don't think he has upside beyond that. I think Chubb could possibly be top 5.
Well, I know, Adam, you love Miles Sanders. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't understand why we're not seeing that upside in Miles Sanders. I think he has RB1 upside. I think he has like the best player in fantasy upside, the same way Dalvin Cook had that upside, but we didn't see it until he stayed healthy and got a full season as the feature back. And it's kind of like the Kamara versus Derrick Henry argument, is that the safer guy is the one who's involved in the passing game. And while Nick Chubb was on pace for over 300 touches in 8 games with Kareem Hunt, he was on pace for 30 catches. Miles Sanders was on pace for a lot more than that when Jordan Howard got hurt. And Miles Sanders was the number 6 running back in fantasy, not counting Week 17, after he took over for Jordan Howard. After the Howard injury, Week 17, Miles Sanders himself got hurt. So we're talking about the second running back drafted in the NFL draft in 2018, a 5-star recruit going into college, someone who was great in college even though he didn't play much because he was behind Saquon Barkley. And, okay, the Eagles are going to add another running back. Is it going to be someone better than Kareem Hunt? Heck no. So, I mean, look, I have no issue with Chubb. I really like Chubb, and that was a tough decision for me. I felt because I had been pumping up Miles Sanders all offseason, I almost felt obligated to take Miles Sanders. And I would take him in the first round, but I didn't have to, Jamie. But I just don't understand why we're not seeing the potential for a workhorse running back on Philadelphia who is awesome, behind a good offensive line, to be a complete fantasy superstar. It's definitely there.
Yeah, NFL draft is going to be telling with what the Eagles do. If they do add somebody early in the draft, could be bad for Miles Sanders. If they wait a little bit, could be great for Miles Sanders. But right now, Sanders is in a great spot. Adam loves him. Heath loves Nick Chubb. We like both of them, so kudos to the two of you for taking those 2 running backs. As we take a look at the rest of round 2, we could throw up that graphic, seeing the rest of that round. You'll see some receivers coming off at the end of the board here. A little bit of a surprise, at least to me. Kenny Golladay going at the end of round 2 and ahead of some other prominent wide receivers. You see him here ahead of DJ Moore, ahead of Amari Cooper, who went in round 3, ahead of Adam Thielen, who went in round 3, ahead of Juju Smith-Schuster, who went in round 3. I might be in the minority of not wanting Golladay ahead of those receivers, but Heath, I'll start with you. Would you have taken Golladay in that spot over some of those other guys, Moore, Cooper, Thielen, and Juju?
No, I think most of those guys need to go ahead of Golladay. I would expect that non-PPR is going to be his better format. I just don't think he has a chance to be a huge target guy, but absolutely with his yards per catch and with his ability to score touchdowns, if Matthew Stafford just stays healthy for a full season, I wouldn't be all that surprised if he has a chance to be a top 12 wide receiver in non-PPR. But I don't want to take him especially over someone like DJ Moore. Personally, I wouldn't take him over Courtland Sutton in this format.
Interesting. Yeah, Courtland Sutton went a little bit later. Dave, what about you? How do you feel about Golladay in that spot?
The dude averaged just over 12 non-PPR fantasy points per game with Stafford last year. He finished first in the NFL in receiving touchdowns, 7th in receiving yards, and he had the 25th most targets. He hasn't even had 120 targets yet in a season. He's come close each of the last 2 years, but he hasn't gotten to that mythical number yet. I'm excited about Golladay because I'm expecting the Lions defense to still be a problem, their run game still be a question mark, and it's going to mean more passing from Matthew Stafford and more targets, and maybe he finally crosses over into that 120 and 130 range, and you already know that he's a mammoth in the red zone to catch a bunch of touchdowns, and he's a deep ball threat. So he can kind of do it all. I think he's a sneaky good receiver that you try and get as late as you can, but if you really want to grab him, round 2 is going to be the point where you do it.
Adam, are you taking him in round 2?
I hadn't really thought about it, but I think it makes sense. I had thought about it at this point, but going over Juju, I don't think I do that, but it kind of makes sense. I mean, he was the number 3 wide receiver in non-PPR last year, and for his career, he's averaging, I think, over 17 yards per catch. So he's kind of like Tyreek Hill in that, no, the targets may not really be there in huge numbers. The catches won't be there in huge numbers, but the yards per catch is consistently great. That is not fluky with Kenny Golladay. He makes big plays, and he's going to be extremely efficient when he catches the ball. With Matthew Stafford, first 8 games of the season, he was on pace for 70 catches, 1,280 yards, and 14 touchdowns. I mean, that's a lot, but I think the catches and the yards are realistic. And then I think 10 to 12 touchdowns is realistic. If you gave me 1,280 yards and 11 touchdowns, I think that's a top 24 player.
It's certainly in the discussion. You know, I guess the question becomes, does TJ Hawkinson take on a bigger role, and does that hurt some of what Kenny Golladay does? Marvin Jones still being there, bringing back Danny Amendola. And let's face it, we still don't know how healthy Stafford is going to be coming back from the back injury, which cost them 8 games last year. If he's not the same guy or suffers an injury again, are you willing to buy into Kenny Golladay with a 2nd-round pick? And I guess we're sort of splitting hairs here. R.J. White took Kenny Golladay end of round 2, Amari Cooper beginning of round 3. The one surprise, I'm sure, for you, Adam, would be Adam Thielen falling to round 3. You like him as a potential top 5 wide receiver. I don't know if it's in non-PPR or just PPR, but somebody I think you would probably take over Kenny Golladay as well. Let's go now to round 3 as we take a look at the picks that came off the board in this round, and we start to see some of the running backs on the move, one in particular being Todd Gurley. So we see Gurley going toward the second half of round 3, pick number 31 overall. At pick number 29 overall, Chris Carson comes off the board. Now, Carson coming back from an injury, he's expected to be fine at the start of training camp, hopefully. But when we see Chris Carson ahead of Gurley and ahead of some other running backs as well, I mean, you know, you see Marlon Mack there. He went ahead of guys like James Conner, Melvin Gordon. I'm not necessarily so comfortable taking Carson that high. Dave, what about you?
I'm not either, and I've usually been a big Chris Carson backer. I love his style. I love the Seahawks offense and how they want to run the football. But he ranked just ahead of Gurley last year in fantasy points per game. He was 11th. Gurley was 12th. Gurley is probably in a slightly better situation now in Atlanta because I believe that Seattle's going to add a running back in the draft. I don't think they're going to sit tight with what they have with Rashad Penny coming back from injury and Travis Homer being just a guy. And Chris Carson's been dealing with a lot of injuries himself, just like Todd Gurley. I don't feel great about either of these backs, but simply put, Gurley likely to see more work in Atlanta and certainly work that goal line. I think I'm ready to trust him now ahead of Chris Carson, who's coming off of his own hip issue and may not have that locked workload like we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I guess you can't really knock Todd Gurley for injury or, you know, having an arthritic knee and not factor that in with Chris Carson. I think if Chris Carson were fully healthy, this would be a great pick, but there are some question marks there. And I took Marlon Mack 3 picks after Todd Gurley went, and I was pretty happy with that. Look, you're getting to the point, there are no more running backs who don't have some type of question mark on them, right? You know, whether it's their role in the passing game, whether it's their health, whether it's just inconsistency. I don't know that we have a real stud running back here, so I think these picks are fine, but I would probably take Gurley over Carson. I was also happy to get Marlon Mack a few picks later.
Yeah, I was a little upset you took Marlon Mack right in front of me. I was hoping for Marlon Mack at that spot, so you ruined me once again. Heath, I think you like Chris Carson probably a little bit more than the rest of us. Make the case for him in that spot.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say, okay, we're going to hold the injuries in the same regard for both Carson and Gurley and just look at what they did last year. And Chris Carson was actually good, averaged 4.5 yards per carry and had over 300 touches. I don't have any reason to believe that Atlanta, a team that has traditionally split carries between running backs even more than Seattle did last year, is going to give Gurley more work than Carson. Now, the NFL draft could change this. If Seattle spends a considerable amount on a running back, then yeah, I'd rather have Gurley. But as of right now, I'll take Chris Carson, especially in non-PPR, over Gurley.
Yeah, I'll give you the asterisk. Obviously, if Carson's not right for training camp, I'm sure you'll switch that and put Gurley ahead of Carson. So we'll hopefully get a healthy Chris Carson. That could be a great pick at number 29 overall. I would rather have Gurley at this point and some other guys that went actually behind Gurley, guys like Melvin Gordon and even Le'Veon Bell. I'm sure Heath would probably have Le'Veon Bell rather higher as well. End of round 3, we saw some good value picks. A couple wide receivers come off the board as we take a look at the round once again. Calvin Ridley, somebody that we're all excited about going into his third year, especially with Austin Hooper gone. Cooper Kupp as well, guys going at the end of the round. Adam, when you look at the value for those two guys, is that kind of a steal for Kupp and for Ridley in those spots?
Man, I don't know with Cooper Kupp. The Rams passing game is so strange. Kupp is a little touchdown dependent, but he gets the touchdowns. It's consistently the red zone threat for Jared Goff. He was the number 4 wide receiver in fantasy last year. He caught a touchdown in each of his last 5 games of the season, and he had 1,161 yards. That's pretty good. That was with Brandon Cooks really struggling last year. Ridley, I think, is a good pick. I mean, he was a little inconsistent, and he needed Austin Hooper's injury before he really got going. Sanu was traded, Hooper got hurt, and then Calvin Ridley took off. Well, neither of those guys are going to be on the team. I don't think Hayden Hurst is going to pick up the slack from Austin Hooper. So I actually really like this pick. I think Calvin Ridley's got more upside than Cooper Kupp, which is funny to say since Kupp just finished as a top 5 wide receiver. But I think Calvin Ridley has more star potential than Cooper Kupp and has a chance to be more like an early second-round pick in 2021. I love that pick from Ben Schrager.
Yeah, the thing I like about Kupp is what we saw before he tore his ACL in 2018. He was on pace for a monster season. Then he comes back last year to a team that struggled to run the ball. And we don't know what they're going to look like running the ball now with Todd Gurley. Hopefully Darrell Henderson is good, but we just don't know. So I took Kupp. I was thrilled to get him in that spot at the end of round 3. I like Calvin Ridley as well. They're basically back-to-back in my rankings. But to get them at the end of the 3rd round, when you see guys like Kenny Golladay going at the end of the 2nd round, DJ Moore as well, I think that's just good value for both of those guys. So we'll talk about a lot of these wide receivers more throughout the course of the offseason, but we have more mock draft to get to when we look at some of these running backs that have changed teams. When we come back after the break, we're going to start to tell you about Melvin Gordon and David Johnson. Are they worth going in the 4th round after changing teams this offseason? We'll tell you next here on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today. We're breaking down our 12-team non-PPR mock draft, which came after free agency, taking a look at some of the moves in the NFL that will impact some of the fantasy moves you could be making. It's a 2 running back, 3 wide receiver league, and some fun wide receivers are coming off the board here in round 4, and there could be a little bit of a controversial pick. Our buddy Adam Azer may have taken T.Y. Hilton a little bit too soon as we look at round 4 here. A.J. Brown comes off the board to kick off the top of the round. Maybe another controversial pick as well, going ahead of some of these other wide receivers. But Adam takes T.Y. Hilton at 39th overall. Then Heath takes Cortland Sutton at 40th overall. You see later on in the round, Tyler Lockett at 44, Allen Robinson at 48. A lot of people might consider taking those other receivers ahead of T.Y. Hilton. So Adam, why T.Y. so soon?
In his last 3 seasons with a healthy Andrew Luck, T.Y. Hilton has been the number 10 wide receiver in this format, number 4, and number 13. No, Phillip Rivers is not going to be Andrew Luck, but I really don't care about what happened last year. Jacoby Brissett was really bad, and T.Y. Hilton is still just by far the best wide receiver, best target in the passing game in general for the Indianapolis Colts. So I think that I don't think I'm too high on him. I think everybody's a little bit too low on T.Y. Hilton. I am worried about his injuries, though. I mean, it does feel like he's starting to break down a little bit, and going with him over a younger guy like Cortland Sutton is tough. I think Allen Robinson's touchdowns could be low. I think Tyler Lockett is the 2nd best wide receiver on the Seahawks. I don't think he should have gone ahead of DK Metcalf. So Hilton and Sutton's a really tough call. You're sort of projecting upside for Sutton and hoping he takes that leap in year 3. But I just think if T.Y. Hilton is the same guy that he's been throughout his career, when he's had a good quarterback, then T.Y. Hilton in round 4 is going to be a really good pick.
Heath, you said you would have considered Cortland Sutton ahead of Kenny Golladay, who went in round 2, so you must have been thrilled that he was sitting there for you in round 4.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the Broncos receiving core right now, it's Cortland Sutton and no one else. They can go ahead and add a receiver, add 2 receivers in the draft, and I'm not going to be all that concerned about his target share. Drew Lock was pretty impressive in his first 5 games as an NFL starter. We would expect him to improve in his 2nd year. And I think I've got Cortland Sutton 10 spots ahead of T.Y. Hilton. It's interesting. You talk about the last 3 years that T.Y. Hilton played with a healthy Andrew Luck. Like, was one of those seasons when he was 25 years old? T.Y. Hilton's going to be a 31-year-old wide receiver who has had injury problems each of the past 2 seasons, and he has a quarterback in Phillip Rivers who's almost 40 and looked like he was on the decline last year. I don't think T.Y. Hilton's a top 20 wide receiver in any format.
Wow, there you go. So Cortland Sutton over T.Y. Hilton for Heath. Hilton over Sutton for Adam. Let's take a look at the rest of the round here as we get some running backs going. And Dave, you see David Johnson. I'm already giving him his initials. David Johnson coming off the board at 41st overall. Will Brinson may have made a mistake in a previous draft and thought that D. Johnson was Duke Johnson. That's a conversation for another time. But he does take David Johnson here at 41st overall, ahead of Melvin Gordon, ahead of Le'Veon Bell, ahead of James Conner, and maybe even make the argument ahead of Mark Ingram as well. Too soon for David Johnson with the move to Houston. He's going to be the starter for Bill O'Brien, but I don't know if that's good value for him in the 4th round.
Way too soon. Way too soon. So many of those other running backs should have gone ahead of David Johnson, and we just don't know how good David Johnson is anymore. Last season, at the beginning of the year, he looked okay. He didn't look like an amazing world beater. And then when he came back from injury, man, he had the speed of a rock. And I'm not talking about a rock that you're throwing down a hill. I'm talking about a rock that's like sitting in the middle of the street or something like that. He was not moving well. I can't imagine what the Texans see in him that's going to get them so excited that they were getting ready to trade, that they did trade DeAndre Hopkins and take on all of David Johnson's salary. It's mystifying. And this pick by Will Brinson was mystifying. There were so many other running backs out there that I would have taken ahead of David Johnson. You have to mitigate that risk with him. Round 4 is too soon. Round 5 might be too soon. Not until we get to training camp and we see how he looks and we get reports out of Houston, that's when I'll get more comfortable taking David Johnson at a level like this.
Yep, too early for David Johnson, but Will is determined to have a D. Johnson on all of his teams, so maybe this was his only chance. But I didn't think it was too early for Melvin Gordon, and I certainly didn't think it was too early for Le'Veon Bell, who were the next 2 picks. You know, Le'Veon Bell had over 300 touches last year in 15 games. He's done a really good job outlining this. There's no way he can be as inefficient as he was. I do think there's a downside with Le'Veon Bell, that the coaching staff just gets sick of him and he doesn't get the same share of the work, but until that happens, you know, I'm going to treat him as the workhorse back for the Jets. I like Melvin Gordon here. I thought this was a good pick in the middle of round 4. Pat Shurmur's history is to have a workhorse back and running backs involved in the passing game. It was Saquon Barkley. It was Dalvin Cook for, I think, 4 games, and then after that, Latavius Murray got a ton of work, while Jerick McKinnon got to work in the passing game. But I think Melvin Gordon's much more suited to be the pass catcher than Phillip Lindsay. And I think the Broncos have shown they can be a run-heavy team and split the carries between 2 guys, with Melvin Gordon maybe getting 240 carries or something like that, and Phillip Lindsay maybe getting half of that. So I think the work will be there for Gordon. I think the touchdowns will be there for Melvin Gordon. James Conner's a fun pick too. A lot of upside with these running backs. I don't think any of them have as much upside as James Conner. All he has to do is be what he was in 2018 when he and Ben Roethlisberger. Hey, if we're throwing away Juju's season, right, and treating him more, you know, not exactly the same, but not as big of a discount as you're seeing with Conner. The only thing you're looking at with Conner is he was hurt. But if he can go back to being on a good offense and get the work and catch the passes, there's no reason why James Conner can't be a huge steal. We're talking, I think, 45th overall. That could be a great pick.
Yeah, it could absolutely be a great pick, and we'll see with the Steelers if they decide to add another running back in the NFL draft after getting Benny Snell last year, Jalen Samuels the year before. But Conner, I agree with you, Adam, has a chance to bounce back in a big way. Could be a steal in this round. So we go from the running backs in round 4 to some interesting running backs in round 5, and you can make a case, maybe a little bit of a reach for a couple of running backs, and certainly in some of the spots that they were taking. Darrell Henderson is the one that jumps off the page at 49th overall. You look at David Montgomery at 50th, that's probably a good spot for him. I thought Damian Williams was actually steal at 53rd overall. And then Ronald Jones at 58th overall is interesting as well, after Kerryon Johnson was taken at 56. So Heath, when you look at the running backs here, Henderson replacing Todd Gurley for the Rams. Ronald Jones looking at the potential of being the guy in Tampa Bay with Tom Brady now there, and no real competition for carries as of now. Too early for these guys in round 5, or after the running backs that have come off the board, this is the spot you have to try and get them if you want them?
You know, Ben Gretsch had a thing last year where he talked about the running back dead zone. I think round 5 in this draft was maybe the running back dead zone, because I don't like the Ronald Jones pick there at the end of round 5. That's maybe where I'd take him in May. If we get through May and they don't make a significant addition at running back, then he's a round 5 pick. But I will say I like Ronald Jones more than the running backs that went before him, except for Damian Williams. I'd take Ronald Jones right now over Darrell Henderson I'd take him over David Montgomery. So I think it's like these guys are fine in round 6, probably just a round too early. But with Henderson and Jones, it's not that hard to see how the top 15 upside exists. It's just that you might be using a round 5 pick on a player that you don't ever want to start.
All right, Dave, when you look at Henderson, you talked about this on a couple shows throughout the week that you wouldn't take him before maybe the 75th overall pick. He went clearly before that here. Ronald Jones, again, somebody that is going to be polarizing because he did have over 1,000 total yards last year, but it was very choppy. Ended the season playing well, but we know what the downside could be. Do you think it was too soon for these two guys as well?
I do. And honestly, the only pick here that I really like among the running backs is Damian Williams. And even that pick, I'm just kind of, all right, I need a running back. This is one that's good. I know what his role is. I know what his team is. Fingers crossed that the Chiefs don't add another running back and you go with him. We don't know for sure what's going to happen with Ronald Jones and with Darrell Henderson. So I almost think you've got to play it out. Like if you're drafting now, these are the types of players that you can see the upside in, and you almost have to reach for them if you're desperate for a running back. And it's all the more reason why you should take your running back sooner if that's the way you feel. Now, if you like going receiver early and you want to get running backs with high upside, here they are. Here's Darrell Henderson. Here's Ronald Jones. Go take them. Cross your fingers that they're going to end up being the lead backs for your team. But we've seen so much evidence from both of them that they're not natural talents at the NFL level. They were great in college, and then they come to the pros, and 1 year for Henderson didn't really get a lot of work. I think that says something. Like, you really couldn't find playing time behind an injured Todd Gurley. That tells me that you weren't ready. He was definitely not ready, and he got benched at times during his second season. There's risk taking running backs like this in round 5. But if they're the only guys left standing in their respective backfields by the time we get to August, then I get it. But for now, I don't get it.
Well, I just think you have to look at the running backs that went after these guys. We're talking about round 5 running backs here. So we're 60 picks deep after this round. And then who's in round 6? One running back is in round 6, and it's Phillip Lindsay. And in my opinion, Phillip Lindsay is basically a little bit better than a handcuff at this point. And then after that, you're talking about Sony Michel could be a good pick. But really, the running back quality gets so bad after this that I think these picks are perfectly fine. They have upside. They have a chance for big workloads. And it's a little bit of a delicate balance trying to draft between what's happening now and what you think is going to happen after the NFL draft. But you know, I think these picks are fine because you have to look at who's going after them. And after them, it's really garbage. Guys that you should not be drafting to be a starter. They're really just bench running backs with maybe a couple of exceptions after this.
Yeah, no, I think you guys both said it best. It kind of comes down to being maybe in a desperate situation and looking at what the potential upside could be for both those guys. If we do get past the NFL draft and Henderson is the starter for the Rams and Ronald Jones is the lead back for the Bucs, you're going to see them go in round 5. And in some cases, they may creep up a little bit higher depending on how running backs do come off the board. So you are speculating now. But again, once we get past the end of April, we could see a change for both of these guys, maybe for the better, potentially for the worse. Let's go now to round 6, and we see some tight ends come off the board here. It was interesting to see how the tight ends are always drafted, especially after some moves have been made. Austin Hooper being one of those guys on the move, not getting selected in round 6. But we do see Hunter Henry come off the board, as well as Darren Waller. And we spent some time talking about these two guys with what's happened to them this offseason. Henry getting the franchise tag, getting a new quarterback with Phillip Rivers on the move, Tyrod Taylor, the expected starter to open the season, and then Waller getting plenty of competition at the tight end spot for the Raiders, the big name being Jason Witten joining the roster there. So Heath, when you look at these two guys here, are you Waller? Are you Henry? Are you avoiding these guys and waiting for somebody later? What would you have done if you're facing the need for a tight end here in round 6?
I do think it's closer in non-PPR than it is in PPR. In PPR, I'll take Waller by a mile. I'm not worried about Jason Witten. I was worried the Raiders were going to add a true number 1 wide receiver, and they might in the NFL draft. That would make me worried about Darren Waller. But still, I'll take in non-PPR Waller over Henry. There was just so much involvement. There's no reason to think they've soured on Darren Waller after he was their best pass catcher, regardless of whether he played tight end, wide receiver, or running back. And he might play a little bit of wide receiver this year. They need the help out there if they don't draft one in the first couple of rounds. So for now, I'll still take Waller by a pretty decent margin.
All right, other picks in the 6th round, we had some wide receivers coming off the board. And Dave made a selection that I think could be a little bit, I don't know, controversial, but a little bit curious, taking Jarvis Landry as his, I think your number one wide receiver, if I'm not mistaken, Dave, over Will Fuller, Julian Edelman, Tyler Boyd. I know you like Boyd as well. So, Dave, why'd you take Landry over some of those guys, specifically somebody like Fuller, who has a chance to be a potential superstar now that DeAndre Hopkins is gone?
Yeah, I'm sour on Fuller, so I'm probably the wrong person to talk about him. But all the injuries that he has, all the mistakes that he makes.
We'll talk about Landry, why you made the pick there.
Because I think that, assuming that he's close to 100% for the start of the season, I feel like he's the safest of the bunch. I just think that volume will be his friend. A little worried about Tyler Boyd in a non-PPR being able to get close to 1,000 yards and to get a decent amount of touchdowns. And I went full-on experimental in this mock. This was my first wide receiver. I took a tight end, a quarterback, and 3 running backs before I even got to this point. And part of it is how the board fell to me. And I knew that I'd hate my wide receivers when I was done. At least in the case of Landry, and we've talked about it on our podcast. We've mentioned it here on CBS Sports HQ. He always seems to be a good value pick at the end of the year. So I'm just riding that wave. I'm hoping that the hip is okay by the time the season starts. If it's not okay, then it's going to be a terrible pick. But he's been pretty reliable, not as a number 1 receiver. Forget that. He's not going to be that. But as someone who can contribute some fantasy points to your roster, maybe be a number 2 receiver by the end of the year, I think it's fine.
Yeah, I would have taken Fuller here, but I think you're seeing in a 3 wide receiver league that the talent dries up pretty quickly. So, Dave, did you take both a quarterback and a tight end with your first 5 picks?
I did. I broke my rule. I took them both.
You know what? We used to say a lot, you shouldn't do that because it leaves you thin at other positions. But the truth of the matter is your roster at the end of the year is going to be very different than your roster at the beginning of the year. So I can get on board with that philosophy of just getting elite players at quarterback and tight end and trying to figure it out at wide receiver. But obviously this is a tough range of wide receivers there to be getting your number 1. I like Will Fuller, but I understand what Dave says. I mean, he's always hurt. But if Will Fuller stays healthy, I would expect him as currently the number 1 wide receiver. And my guess is no matter what happens in the NFL draft, Will Fuller will be the number 1 wide receiver for the Houston Texans. That's an exciting prospect, and that's the guy I would have gone with here.
All right, so Will Fuller, Julian Edelman, Jarvis Landry, Tyler Boyd, some interesting receivers coming off the board in round 6. What about the wide receivers coming off the board in round 7? We're going to take a look at one that could be maybe a sophomore sensation. Marquise Brown is somebody that was drafted in round 7. We'll tell you about his draft value coming up next year on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today. We're reviewing our 12-team non-PPR mock draft that we did following free agency, taking a look at some of the players that could be changing their fantasy values after changing some teams. We've spent some time talking about some interesting wide receivers in round 6 with Julian Edelman, Will Fuller, Jarvis Landry, Tyler Boyd. Now let's take a look at round 7 and some other wide receivers coming off the board, Marquise Brown and Darius Slayton, 2 guys who had some up and down rookie campaigns. Marquise Brown battling through the foot injury, Darius Slayton dealing with some quarterback changing, and then eventually taking over as what really was the number 1 wide receiver for the Giants. When you see Brown at number 76, Dave taking Slayton at number 78. Keith, I'll give you the first word here. What could these guys do as sophomores, and which one do you like better?
I do like Marquise Brown quite a bit more just because there's not the same competition. I think even getting rid of Hayden Hurst helps a little bit, frees up a few targets. I think Lamar Jackson will throw more than he did last year, so there's an opportunity for Marquise Brown to probably not get to 120 targets this year, but at least get over 100. I am concerned about Slayton, despite the fact that he was the more productive wide receiver on a per-target basis. He really needed injuries to have any sort of involvement in the passing game. Even when one of Sterling Shepard, Golden Tate, Evan Ingram, Saquon Barkley was hurt, Slayton didn't have that big of an impact. He needed at least 2 of those guys to be out to have a big impact. I expect Barkley, Shepard, Tate, Ingram to all be involved in the offense early in the year. That might make Slayton just a deep shot player that gets 3 or 4 targets a game. I'm not sure he's going to be fantasy relevant without an injury.
Dave, you told us earlier in the show that you were chasing wide receiver a little bit. Are you chasing Darius Slayton, or were you happy to get him in the spot?
So I was very happy to get Darius Slayton because I love the potential, and I admit that I wish I could have gotten him a round or two later. Hell yeah, I wish I could have gotten him a round or two later, but I'm drafting with Sharks here, and I need wide receivers bad, and I see the upside with Darius Slayton. And here's the thing, when Jason Garrett called plays for the Cowboys, and granted he had receivers that were more established than Darius Slayton, he did have a guy get over 1,000 yards and a receiver get over 8 touchdowns, or at least 8 touchdowns. 5 of 6 seasons. In the one season he didn't do it, 2 receivers had 850. Wideouts eat in this offense. And I look at the wide receivers in New York, and I think about who are the big play guys. Sterling Shepard doesn't profile as a big play guy. Golden Tate's days as being even a moderate play guy seem to be out the window. I think Slayton is the one that has the juice to be a potential number 1 knockout type of receiver in that offense. I was rushing for wide receivers. I wanted to get guys that I liked. This is a receiver who I like. I paid a little bit of a price for him, but it's round 7. By that point in the draft, you need to take shots on guys with upside anyway.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Darius Slayton is going to be Des Bryant or Mari Cooper, but he certainly has a chance to if that's what Jason Garrett's going to use him as in that type of role. Some other wide receivers that came off the board here, Christian Kirk and John Brown, and we know that their value has changed with some additions to their respective rosters. Kirk getting DeAndre Hopkins as a member of the Cardinals, Brown getting Stephon Diggs as a member of the Bills. Adam, when you look at these two guys, you're still very confident in Christian Kirk, not so much in John Brown, but break down these two picks.
I would not say I'm very confident in Christian Kirk. It's actually kind of interesting. I know where you're coming from. I think I'm more confident in Kirk now than other people, whereas before the DeAndre Hopkins trade, I didn't really see much appeal in Christian Kirk because he just hasn't really been that good. I feel like people have assigned some level of production to him that hasn't realistically been there. He scored 3 touchdowns last year, and they were all in one game, as I recall, against Tampa Bay. No, he scored 4 touchdowns, and 3 of them were in one game. But, I like him more now. I feel like people have buried Christian Kirk, and I think he could thrive as a number 2 receiver like Calvin Ridley has thrived. You just need to see this offense take a jump under Kingsbury with Kyler Murray. And if the offense takes a big jump, I think that Christian Kirk will also take that jump. And whereas I do think the Bills will take that jump as well, I don't know. I'm just not really feeling it with John Brown. He's so dependent on big plays, and he's no longer the best receiver at doing that on his team. So I don't have as much interest in Brown. I prefer Christian Kirk now.
All right, well, speaking of Brown, his quarterback goes in round 8 as we transition from round 7 to round 8 when we see Josh Allen come off the board, Kyler Murray also off the board in round 8, and Deshaun Watson off the board as the quarterbacks are starting to come. And as we always tell you with our mock draft, just because of the nature of how we all draft, we wait on quarterbacks. So most likely you're not going to see Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, and Deshaun Watson falling this far. But this is what we are, and this is kind of the order I think you're going to see them go. Maybe Murray goes ahead of Prescott. Russell Wilson went ahead of both. Josh Allen ahead of Deshaun Watson. Keith, is that something people are just going to have to get used to, that Josh Allen, Kyler Murray ahead of Deshaun Watson now that he doesn't have DeAndre Hopkins anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very close to where I would take all of these guys in round 8. I've got them projected almost for the same exact fantasy total. I do think in most drafts, you're going to see Kyler Murray go a round or 2 before this, and you might see Josh Allen go a round or 2 later than this. But I would go Allen, then Murray, then Watson, and all in the same round. I do think there's top 5 upside still for all 3 of these quarterbacks. But Watson is the one that has to scare you the most because we haven't seen him without a true number 1 wide receiver, and he won't have one in 2020.
Yeah, we'll find out again what they do in the NFL draft. As we said earlier, Will Fuller, Kenny Stills, these are the top 2 wide receivers for Watson right now. He loses Hopkins. Kyler Murray gains him. Stephon Diggs goes to Buffalo. That's a big boost for Josh Allen. And another wide receiver on the move was Robby Anderson, and he went in this round, in round 8, goes from the Jets to the Panthers, reuniting with Coach Matt Rule, who coached him at Temple. And so, Dave, when you look at Robby Anderson, we could also throw Breshad Perriman in this spot here. Too soon for these guys, or is this the right spot to see the 2 wide receivers on the move, Perriman now replacing Robby Anderson with the Jets?
I almost feel like they went in this round because their names have been in the headlines and people say, oh, yeah, Robby Anderson just signed. I remember that. I'll take him. Or, yeah, Breshad Perriman just replaced Robby Anderson. I'll take him. I feel like it's too soon. At least 1 round too soon, if not 2 or 3 rounds too soon. In the case of Robby Anderson, Robbie's a good wide receiver, but he's on a team with a lot of other good wide receivers, and they're going to spread the ball around quite a bit. So I don't see him as anything more than a decent bench wideout, not even one of those priority target guys you're going to look for at about this point in the draft. And Perriman, who knows? Last season he was incredible at the end of the year, but he was playing in a very progressive and aggressive offense in Tampa Bay. He was the #1 receiver there. And now we just don't know how good he'll be as the de facto #1 outside guy for the Jets, but probably not going to be the receiver who leads that team in targets, catching passes from Sam Darnold. A Sam Darnold who could be under siege, by the way, because that offensive line still isn't great. Bottom line is I think that there were other receivers on the board that were better picks.
All right, so Breshad Perriman on the move, Robby Anderson on the move, Tom Brady on the move. He leaves New England, as we're all well aware, joining the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. When did he get drafted in this 12-team non-PPR mock? We'll tell you coming up next as we wrap up the final 2 rounds we'll be looking at, and also taking a look at our own teams here next on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today. We're wrapping up our review of our latest 12-team non-PPR mock draft. Here's round 9. See some handcuffed running backs coming off the board. Malcolm Brown for the Rams. Who knows what his role could be now that Todd Gurley's gone. Alexander Madison. Chase Edmonds, I like that pick. I'm sure Adam did not, as the oh no, he didn't take Kenyon Drake in the draft. I'm sure the Kenyon Drake owner did not like that, as Chase Edmonds could be very prominent if something happens to Drake. These are the picks that happened in round 9. In round 10, we see some more flyers coming off the board. You know, players that could have an impact, or guys that could be some depth. Back-to-back Bears picks of Anthony Miller and Tariq Cohen. Who doesn't love the Bears? Adam does get his handcuff there with Boston Scott to back up Miles Sanders. Tony Pollard as the handcuff for Ezekiel Elliott. And then we see some good picks there at the end of the round. James White could be interesting with the quarterback change for New England. We'll see if he's still going to catch a lot of passes from the new passer for the Patriots. Let's take a look at our teams here as we all took part in this mock draft. Adam, we'll start with you. You took a lot of players that I liked. You took Marlon Mack right in front of me. Same thing with Ronald Jones. You love T.Y. Hilton here, but Russell Wilson, you took him ahead of Dak Prescott, ahead of Kyler Murray. You're still very confident in Russ.
Hey, man, more than 30 touchdown passes in 4 of his last 5 seasons. Dak Prescott's had 1 great fantasy season. So, yes, Russell Wilson is my #3 quarterback. I like my team. I think it's probably going to come down to Marlon Mack and T.Y. Hilton because I love Miles Sanders and Tyreek Hill. I love my quarterback. I'm very confident in DK Metcalf to at least be a #3 wide receiver. So is Hilton or Mack, just one of them, going to be really good this year? If they are, I'm confident. And Brandon Cooks is apparently on the Chargers because the Rams completely screwed up their logo. It is ridiculous. It needs to change.
Adam will be watching a lot of Seattle and Indianapolis games next year with this fantasy roster. Dave, when you take a look at your roster, you told us you went heavy on running backs. So you took Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs with your first 2 picks. Le'Veon Bell was there for you in round 4, Patrick Mahomes and Mark Andrews. The other 2 picks that you took in round 5. When you look at the receiving core, though, how nervous are you with Landry, Slayton, and Williams as your top guys?
I'm comfortably numb, Jamie, because the rest of my team is absolutely loaded. If you're going to take a quarterback and a tight end with your first 5 picks, might as well be the top quarterback in fantasy and one of the top 4 tight ends on the board. That's what I did. And I love my wide receiver depth, the 2 studs that are going to start for me. And Le'Veon Bell is the flex. Check this stat. Last year, there were only 11 wide receivers that averaged double-digit fantasy points per game. 19 such running backs did that, and a bunch of them were closer to 13, 14, 15 plus non-PPR points per game. So running back is where I'm going to head in non-PPR drafts, and I'll just make do with the receivers that I cobbled together in the middle rounds and off the waiver wire. In no way am I committed to the trio of Slayton, Williams, and Landry at wide receiver. I'll find guys throughout the year.
Keith, when we take a look at your team here, one interesting thing that jumps out, both Browns running backs. You comfortable with Chubb and Hunt starting them?
Yeah, I mean, Hunt was the last running back I felt okay about as a borderline #2 because I started off with Travis Kelce and Lamar Jackson as 2 of my first 3 picks alongside Nick Chubb. Loved the fact that Courtland Sutton fell into my lap. You know, for starting off with tight end, running back, quarterback, I don't hate my wide receivers, and I like my depth.
All right, well, there's Heath's team, and We'll wrap up the show with my team here. I love my wide receivers with Hopkins, Jones, and Kupp. Robert Woods is a flex, but number 2 running back's a little bit of a concern with Philip Lindsay, but that's what we do with mock drafts. We take chances. We see what's going to work. We see what's not going to work. We'll do lots more mock drafts coming up here throughout the offseason. This has been a fun recap of our 12-team non-PPR mock draft. For Dave, Keith, and Adam, I'm Jamie. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you for watching Fantasy Football Today. Want more of the Fantasy Football Today podcast and non-stop year-round fantasy advice? It's simple. Hit the subscribe button and hang with us all throughout the year.